This is Mr. Joyner and your AP Biology class. And I'm going to go ahead and put up here your warm-up. Write this down. Make a list of characteristics you think are needed in order to classify something as a living thing. Once you're done with those warm-ups, we'll later compare and contrast your list to what you learn later today in class. So go ahead and write your, pause this and write your list. Then you will turn in your warm-ups from yesterday and today to the sub, and she will turn those in for you. Now that your warm-up is done, we're going to go ahead and start with your notes. So make sure you have a piece of paper out, and we're going to go ahead and get started with characteristics of living things. This is still part of your chapter 1 summer reading, and we're going to go ahead and take some notes here. So on your notes, we have some of the things that are characteristics of living things so we're going to compare that to your warm-up. First of all living things are made up of at least one cell or more. I know it seems kind of biased. You're like, well, if you're not a cell, then you're not living, and viruses would argue about that. But the case of the matter is that's what scientists have come to accept. Those things that are living have different levels of organization, stuff that makes sense. Like you have organelles inside of a cell, and then you have things like a nucleus, and you have things that are not considered organelles, like the cytoplasm. And they all show this organization, and there's a reason why they're there. Response to the environment, so they're able to move or at least try to fend themselves off in some kind of way. Grow and develop. Here, they're able to become bigger, and then once they get a cell gets so big, it divides in half and continues to multiply that way. You grow. You never stay the same size. This is what cells lack. I mean, viruses lack. Viruses don't grow and develop. They also don't respond much to their environment. Obtains and uses energy. And you could also tie this back to respiration here too. Obtains and uses energy, so they can consume things or get it from the sunlight. They're either autotrophs or heterotrophs or omnivores, if you want to put it that way too. So you've got all these different ways of obtaining energy. Viruses don't really need that, so they don't fit in this thing. They're not considered living by most scientists. And reproduce. Viruses reproduce in a kind of way, but they need other host cells to reproduce. So again, they don't quite really match that description. So these are the characteristics of living things. And in order to be a living thing, you can't just pick and choose these. You have to be all of these. Then it brings us to our levels of organization. If you're talking about biological things, we have to start here at the cell and then work our way up. If you're talking about from the very get-go, then atoms, which are not considered living things, but you got to start somewhere. So atoms that make up molecules, and molecules that make up the organelles. They make up like the protein structure, and they make up all the little bits and pieces that make that organelle an organelle. Let's not confuse organelles for organs. Organelles are the little pieces inside of a cell. From cell, you have a bunch of cells. They will make up tissue. You have a bunch of different kinds of tissue. They will make up an organ, like they're pointing at this heart right here. Now you add the organ and the blood vessels and all of that, and you have an organ system, like the circulatory system. From there, you put a bunch of organs together, you've got an organism like this duck here, made up of circulatory system, respiratory system, nervous system, and a bunch of organisms of the same kind. So a bunch of ducks makes up a population. Now, if you have two or more different kinds living together, like these ducks and these alligators, you've got a community. And then community and that's so far we've only been talking about the living parts of an environment. If you add the non-living parts of the environment, those that support those living things, you've got an ecosystem. So you have to then include the water and the grass and the air that they need to survive. And then you move on from it. There's other little categories like biomes and things like that, but we can go ahead and jump over to biosphere, made of a bunch of different ecosystems. Biosphere is all the area that supports life. So that goes well into the atmosphere, not into outer space, but that those parts that has air and things like that that supports life. Then that brings us to emergent properties. Emergent properties are properties that come as a whole that were never there as parts. For instance, this airplane here. The airplane here, the wing alone can't do all the uh, flying and moving about and speed and all that that all the parts together have. Things like performance and stability, cost, and aerodynamics. These are all emergent properties that come from these individual parts, the fuselage, the compressor, the engine, and turbine, all working together. You take one of those out, that emergent property kind of changes. Then you have types of feedback. You have positive feedback, you have negative feedback. I remember positive feedback because as one stimulus happens, the response sort of is in the same direction. So, for instance, contractions. When a female is going through contractions, ready to give birth, they will often give her oxytocin. Her body produces that, but they give her extra oxytocin to help bring those contractions even closer together. So it's making that sort of desired thing, the contractions, which you don't think a contraction is a desired thing, but that helps get the baby pushed out. So you need that to happen. And if it's taking too long to happen, they give them oxytocin to make it happen faster. So it's a stimulus response in the same direction. Negative feedback's the more popular one, the one that you can probably think of more examples of. As a stimulus happens, there's a response that's supposed to try to bring that back down so that you don't over this or over that. For instance, when you consume sugar, your body needs to break that down, or you could go into a diabetic shock. So your body produces insulin if you're not diabetic, and that will bring that break those sugars down and bring that level, your diabetic level, it brings that back down by breaking down those sugars. If you're not producing insulin, you have to get that somehow to break those sugars. The same thing with I'd like to mention here real quick. You sweat, you heat up, you sweat to pull yourself back down. That's a negative feedback. Science is a process. So what does that mean? That means that it's free for all to test. So it doesn't just end with you doing your experiment and you had the final word. It's self-correcting. So sometimes when a new apparatus comes about, a new tool comes about, we find something new about what we thought. And then we correct our ideas based on the new data that comes from this new equipment. And science also has to be falsifiable. So you can't use science to prove or disprove beliefs or prove or disprove supernatural events. But so science does have its limits, but science can prove and disprove other things that have to be testable. But in the same token, it also can be falsifiable. What we once thought and held as truths in the light of new science, we say, well, it's not quite what we thought it was. And so therefore, science must have peer review and be ongoing. The scientific method describes the components of controlled experiment, including the variables, control groups, experimental groups, and constants. When we do our labs, we'll need to be able to label those parts of our lab. The variables, there's two types of variables. There's the ones that you can control, that's called the manipulated variable, and then there's the ones that change as a result of what you did. So that would be the resultant variable. You have your control groups, and then you have your experimental groups. The control groups are those that do not receive that experimental thing. So maybe they'll be given, like, for instance, just water in a drug test, or maybe they're just given a sugar pill in a drug test. And then the experimental group receives the experimental treatment to test it against, well, what really happens to that same group if nothing is done to them, and then versus what happens to that group if something is done to them, and be able to create a baseline on that. And then you've got your constants. All you want to keep almost everything constant except that one variable that you're testing. You don't want more than one variable in a test. And that brings us to another main idea, or one of the main ideas. There's four big ideas in AP biology. One is evolution. So we're going to keep looking for that in all the chapters that we go through. How does evolution play a part in what we're talking about, whether it's about the cell or whether it's about living systems, you name it. And then also another big theme is energy, or big idea is energy transfer. So how would for instance, how would a catalyst affect these graphs? So you throw in a catalyst, and that should allow the reaction to happen, but with less energy input. So you're speeding up the reaction. So you have to then draw a new line. So you'll notice with this one, with the catalyst, here's the energy curve. Without the catalyst, you have to put more energy into it to make that same reaction happen. And then this one too, you still have to put more energy in without the catalyst, less energy in with the catalyst. This is an example of a reaction that's spontaneous, that's exergonic. This is an example of one that's endergonic, and we'll talk more about that later. And another big idea, there's four of them, is continuity and change, or continuity and change. So I put here the genetic code. The genetic code seems to it has checks and balances to make sure that it's really not changed all that much. Yes, it's changed through sexual reproduction, but it tries to prevent as many mutations as it can, and as many wrong inputs as it can. So why? We want to know. So we'll see these themes played out from a cell all the way to ecosystems. This resistance to change, and a lot of that deals with the positive and negative feedbacks that are in every system. And then one of the other big ideas is structure and function. One of my favorites to talk about, that things are made and built the way that they are to uh, serve a certain function, a certain job. So it makes sense then that, like, something pointy would be used, that shape, that structure would be used for, like, grabbing onto things, or something that needs lots of friction. Uh, and then here, the its ability to be able to, this stomata here, to be able to open and close, to do a gas exchange, but also to prevent evaporation when it's not wanted. Regulation is another good theme here. You have, again, the dog is an example of the negative feedback mechanism. He gets hot, he regulates that temperature by panting, whereas we regulate ours by sweating. Interdependent, so how this cactus depends upon this fruit bat to pollinate it at night, and it only opens this flower up at night. So it's very specific to that bat. It's not looking for birds to pollinate it, or insects to pollinate it. It wants this bat to pollinate it, so it opens this flower up at night. So they form this interdependence between each other. science and technology. So, and how science comes helps invent these new technologies, and then what those technologies in turn do in bringing light and new data to science. Whereas I show the printing press here allows us to put out more papers and have fewer mistakes in printing instead of it all being handwritten. Hassan Eid al-Haytham, or al-Hazan, the duty of man, and sorry if I butchered that, the duty of man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examinations of it, so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. I like this quote because it sort of typifies the scientific ideas and the thinking and the view that many that scientists should go about having. They should be open to things. They should be willing to say, "Hey, maybe I was wrong." Or they also should look at and examine things and say, "Is that really the way that that works, or is someone trying to pull the wool over my eyes?" Thank you for everything, and we will stop.